All right. This is a bit of what I'd call a public service announcement. It's on Easter. Um, we have we have Passover coming up. We have Easter coming up, and so this is something that I wanted to do, um, touching that topic. There's a lot of ill-informed people. And so a lot of Christians around the world and even non-Christians both celebrate Easter, and they kind of celebrate it for different reasons. There's a lot of secular people that will take that time and they'll have family or whatever with no biblical significance whatsoever. And there are those within Christianity that this becomes a big time of year. And so I want to first try and quickly as possible, because I don't want this to be incredibly long here. I want to be able to hold people's attention spans. I'm going to go through a little bit about Easter. And one of the things that's most amazing to me is if you went out on the street today and you talked to many Christians and you say, when did Christ die? When did Jesus die? Some would even say Easter. So that alone shows confusion about the day, because mainly in Christianity, Easter today is a representation of his resurrection. On the flip side of the coin, Easter actually was a representation of the day he died, but it's not celebrated that way today. The vast majority of Christendom celebrates Easter as his resurrection, which is kind of incorrect. So here real quickly, I'm going to go through some backdrop of Easter. So it says the English term, according to Van Bede, right, relates to Estre, a Teutonic goddess of the rising light of the day in spring, which deity, however, is otherwise unknown even in the Edda, right? Anglo-Saxon Aster, Astron, Old High German Astra, Astara, Ostaren, German Ostern. April was called Easter Monad. The plural Estron is used because the feast lasts 7 days. Like the French plural Paques, it is a translation from the Latin Fest Pascala, the entire octave of Easter. The Greek term for Easter, Pascha, has nothing in common with the verb paskin, to suffer, although by later symbolic writers it was connected with it. It is the Aramaic form of the Hebrew Pesach. In other words, Paschalia is related to Pesach. It gives some different elements here of the origin of the word Easter. If you look at the various forms, which is not listed here, it actually be connected to, and you can see it even through, again, the various forms, Astarte, okay, which has biblical significance, because there were sacred groves listed in the Bible about Astarte, and she was the consort of Baal. But that's a whole other separate topic, and there are people that will debate that to death. By and large, at least from here in this encyclopedia reference, it's saying here that there's at least tied to a Teutonic goddess of light. Okay, so the name Easter is tied to a pagan goddess at the very minimum, and it's also tied to a separate 7-day feast of pagan origin. By the way, who in Christianity today celebrates Easter for 7 days? No one, right? It's just 1 day. The Greeks called Easter, the Pascha Anastasimon, which Good Friday the Pascha Storosimon. The respective terms used by the Latins are Pascha Resurrectionis and Pascha Crucifixionis. So in other words, some of the early Greeks divided the concept of Easter into the day of the crucifixion, the day of the resurrection. Okay, Storozomon being a crucifixion or related to the cross. In Roman and monastic breviaries, the feast bears the title Dominica Resurrectionis. In the Merozoic breviary, and I'm not going to go ahead and go through the Latin there. Having trouble reading the screen from this angle. In the Ambrosian breviary, so on and so forth, the Romance languages have adopted the Hebrew-Greek term Latin Pascha, right? Italian Pasque, Spanish Pascua, and French Poques, and also some Celtic and Teutonic nations use it. Again, you see all these variations of the nations, of these nations and nationalities. By and large, you do not use the term Easter. They use some variation of Passover, Pesach. So it's mainly in Germanic and then various English areas, particularly like America, that has adopted the term Easter. Easter is not necessarily as universal as people would have others believe. So even in German provinces of the Lower Rhine, the people call the feast Paschin, not Ostern. So again, there's areas even in German provinces, even though it's Germanic, to use these titles. They don't even use the common title that we know today as Easter. The word is principally in Spain and Italy identifies with the word solemnity and extended to other feasts, Pascua Florida, Palm Sunday, Pascua de Pentecostes, Pentecost, Pascua de la Natividad, Christmas, Pascua de Epiphany. In some parts of France, also First Communion is called, because whatever time of the year is administered. Easter is the principal feast of the ecclesiastical year. Okay, Leo the First calls it the greatest feast and says that Christmas is celebrated only in preparation for Easter. It is the center of the greater part of the ecclesiastical year, the order of Sundays from the Septuagesima, to the last Sunday after Pentecost, the Feast of Ascension, Pentecost, Corpus Christi, and all the other movable feasts from that of the prayer of Jesus in the garden, Tuesday after, right, to the Feast of the Sacred Heart, depend on Easter's date. Commemorating the slaying of the true Lamb of God and the resurrection of Christ, the cornerstone upon which faith is built is also the oldest feast of the Christian church, as old as Christianity, connecting the link between the Old and the New Testament, and the apostolic fathers do not mention it, and that we first hear of it principally through the controversy of the Quarto Decimans, are purely accidental. So here you just have, again, a lot of things about the origins of words and relations of words and where it's called and different things. And there's many things that are said here that would typically make the Christian go, rah, rah, yeah, this Easter is the biggest day of the Christian year and everything is centered around it, even Christmas and all this stuff, and it sounds all great and good. One of the things that's interestingly that's said here, but it's kind of whitewashed, is there at the end. It says that the apostolic fathers do not mention it, and that we first hear it principally through the controversy of the Quarto Decimans. And we're going to talk a little bit about those people here shortly. But one of the things it kind of, this encyclopedia reference just kind of washes right over that. It says it's purely accidental, that it's an accident that the fathers didn't mention it. We don't hear of it until much later, that there's this great controversy over the 14th. That's what the 14th is how we would translate Quarto Decimans into English. So apparently at some point there was a controversy, and that's when we start to hear of this issue. So if the apostolic fathers do not mention it, that also means that the New Testament does not mention it. I think that's more than an accident. I think that should get people's attention. So it says the connection between the Jewish feast Passover and the Christian feast of Easter is real and ideal. Since Christ died on the first Jewish Easter day, ideal like the revelation between type and reality, because Christ's death and resurrection had its figures and types in the old law, particularly in the Paschal lamb, which was eaten towards the evening of the 14th of Nisan. In fact, the Jewish feast was taken over in Christian Easter celebration. The liturgy sings of passing of Israel through the Red Sea, the Paschal lamb, the column of fire, apart, however, from the Jewish feast, and the Christians would have celebrated the anniversary and death of the resurrection of Christ. But for such a feast, it was necessary to know the exact calendar date of Christ's death. And to know this day was very simple. For the Jews, it was the day after the 14th of the first month, the 15th of Nisan of their calendar. But in other countries of the vast Roman Empire, there were other systems of chronology. So in other words, as this encyclopedia reference is mentioned pretty clearly, that the death of Jesus, or Yeshua, was according to Passover, and that date was on the 14th of Nisan, and it's an accepted concept that this is not a debatable thing. When we look to when Jesus died, the Bible even tells us it was the 14th of Nisan, and it was the time of the Passover. So as we build through this, the question now that I want to put forth is simply this. If this is an accepted and known understanding that the celebration, or that the time and event that Yeshua, Jesus, died was the 14th of Nisan and was Passover, why on earth should Christians today celebrate the day A, on a different day, and B, under a different name? One could easily hand wave and say, does it matter? Well, we can go into shortly whether it matters or not. But here's the thing. Is it not a valid question to ask? For one thing, as we'll see, that this development and change comes from Catholic origin, and there's a whole wider world of Christianity if they come from Baptist or Pentecostal, or if you come from a Lutheran background, if you come from a Methodist background, you're a Protestant. And as a Protestant, you've rejected Catholic authority. So why would you follow Catholic practice? In fact, one of the most things that Protestantism is known for is the notion of sola scriptura, the Bible and the Bible alone. And we've just established, at least in part, that this notion, this day and this celebration is not of apostolic origin. Therefore, it's not found in the New Testament, and therefore it is not sola scriptura. Easter is not sola scriptura. You cannot lay a claim to sola scriptura and celebrate Easter as a Protestant. You can't. You may do it, but you're in violation of your own principles, your own precepts. As a Catholic, this is not an issue. If someone were to hear this as a Catholic, as far as the dictates of your Catholic faith, this is perfectly acceptable practice. Now, whether or not what God feels about it is a whole other matter, but again, within these two groups, Protestants and Catholics, this is okay. If you're a Protestant, it's not okay. It's really that simple. So it says, every fourth year of the Jewish system had an intercalary month. Since this month was inserted not according to some scientific method or some definite rule, but arbitrarily by command of the Sanhedrin, a distant Jewish date can never with certainty be transposed in the corresponding Julian or Gregorian date. The connection between the Jewish and the Christian Pasch explains the movable character of this feast. Easter has no fixed date like Christmas because the 15th of Nisan of the Semitic calendar was shifting from date to date on the Julian calendar. Since Christ, the true Paschal Lamb, had not been slain on the very day when the Jews, or had been slain, on the very day that the Jews in celebration of the Passover emulated the figurative lamb, the Jewish Christians in the Orient followed the Jewish method and commemorated the death of Christ on the 15th of Nisan and his resurrection on the 17th of Nisan. No matter on what day of the week they fell, for this observance they claimed the authority of St. John and St. Philip. So in other words, historically, historically, verifiably, 100% verifiably, that the early Christians, according to authority that they claim, the ones in the Orient claim their authority from the Apostle John and also Philip, that they were told that the method was to follow the Jewish calendar, following both the 14th to 15th of Nisan that Passover fell, and this is how they celebrated it. And it was not an issue. Okay? And in fact, most of the Christian world was dependent on the Jewish calendar for a very long time. It was various groups, as we'll find, that began to split away from that method, where you end up with the method that you have today. It's very interesting because I've been amongst many groups that talked about revival and preached revival, and one of the commonalities in many of them was this notion of the first century. They said, man, the first century really got it right. Well, the problem is, if you think that they have it right and somehow you can acknowledge that we've gone off course, maybe you should look at what they did, because I guarantee you, principally in the first century, they followed this practice. You'll find in the rest of the empire another consideration predominated. Every Sunday of the year was a commemoration of the resurrection of Christ, which had occurred on a Sunday. Because the Sunday after the 14th of Nisan was the historic day of the resurrection, and at Rome this Sunday became Christian feast of Easter. Easter was celebrated in Rome and Alexandria on the first Sunday after the first full moon, after the spring equinox, and the Roman Church claimed for this observance the authority of St. Peter and Paul. So again, the church in Rome claimed St. Peter and Paul. So you have two opposing viewpoints. The spring equinox in Rome fell on the 25th of March, in Alexandria on March 21st. At Antioch, Easter was kept on Sunday after the Jewish Passover. In Gaul, a number of the bishops wishing to escape the difficulties of the paschal computation seem to have assigned Easter to a fixed date of the Roman calendar, celebrating the death of Christ on March 25th, his resurrection on March 27th. Since already in the 3rd century, 25th of March was considered a day of crucifixion, practice was of short duration. In other words, there wasn't a universal time period for the celebration for a very long time. A number of groups did their own thing. So you have principally in the Orient, especially around Antioch, and the churches established, congregations established in the New Testament through the book of Acts and written about in the letters of the epistles, those congregations, some of those congregations whom Paul himself has written to, traveled to, and visited, celebrated according to the Jewish calendar. Interestingly enough, it's claimed that on authority of Peter and Paul, Rome claims a different method. I think the answer to this issue becomes very straightforward. On one hand, you have the Orient claiming the Apostle John and Philip, and on the other hand, you have Peter and Paul. And the issue is there's no apostolic authority for that practice. I think the notion that Paul and Peter could be accredited with this other observance is false. I mean, the fact of the matter is Paul wrote an epistle called Romans to the Romans, and it makes no such mention of any such thing. However, in the Gospels, of which there are 4, do specifically mention the date and time period of which he died, and it is according to the Jewish calendar as Passover. This comes from newadvent.org. The next segment comes from that as well, and it talks about this controversy. It says the first was mainly concerned with the lawfulness of celebrating Easter on a weekday. We read in Eusebius, in his church history, a question of no small importance arose at that time, i.e. the time of Pope Victor, about AD 190. So now we're into the 2nd century. The diocese of all of Asia, from an older tradition, held that the 14th day of the moon, on which the day the Jews were commanded to sacrifice a lamb, should always be observed as the feast of the life-giving Pasch. Right? The Pascha. contending that the fast ought to end on that day, whatever day of the week it may happen to be. However, it was not the custom of the churches in the rest of the world to end at this point, as they observed a practice which from apostolic tradition had prevailed to the present time of terminating the fast on no other day than on that of the resurrection of our Savior. Synods and assemblies of bishops were held on account, and all of them with one consent through mutual correspondence drew up an ecclesiastical decree that the mystery of the resurrection of the Lord should be celebrated on no other day but the Sunday, that we should observe the close of the Paschal fast on that day and that day only. So there's a controversy between Asia and Rome. On what day? And the day again goes back to what we just read before, that Sunday verse following the Jewish calendar. These words of the Father of Church history, followed by some extracts which makes them from controversial letters of the time, tells us almost all that we know concerning the Paschal controversy in this stage. A letter of St. Irenaeus is among the extracts just referred to, and this shows that the diversity of practicing regarding Easter had existed at least from the time of the Pope Sixtus, around 120 AD. Further, Irenaeus states that St. Polycarp, who like the other Asiatics kept Easter on the 14th day of the moon, whatever day of the week that might be, following there in the tradition which he claimed to have derived from St. John the Apostle. He came to Rome in 150 AD about this very question, but could not be persuaded by Pope Anticetus to relinquish his Quartodeciman observance. Nevertheless, he was not debarred from communion with the Roman Church, and St. Irenaeus, while condemning the Quartodeciman practice, nevertheless reproaches Pope Victor with having excommunicated the Asiatics too precipitously and with not having followed the moderation of his predecessors. The question of this debate was therefore primarily after Easter was to be kept on a Sunday, or whether Christians should observe the holy day of the Jews, the 14th of Nisan, which might occur on any day of the week, and those who kept Easter with the Jews were called Quartodecimans or Torontes observance. But even in the time of Pope Victor, this usage hardly extended beyond the churches of Asia Minor, and after the Pope's strong measure, the Quartodecimans seemed to have gradually dwindled away. Origen, in his work, the Philosophia, seems to regard them as merely a handful of wrong-headed nonconformists. So you see how things change over time. It's very interesting that initially people that celebrated according to the practice of the Jews were considered fine. But later on, Victor and then Anticetus decided that that's not fine. And if you're not going to do it the way we say, then you'll be excommunicated. And they excommunicated him from the church. So no longer was it something that was fine. It was something they determined that it was very much not fine. And in other words, you will follow our way. The thing here, it's very plainly laid out that this determination was the determination of men, and it could lay no claim to anything but men. They had no biblical justification for doing what they did. Nevertheless, it was not debarred from communion with the Roman Church, and St. Irenaeus, I already went through that slide. The second stage in the Easter controversy centers around the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. Granted that the great Easter festival was always held on a Sunday and was not to coincide with any particular phase of the moon, which might occur on any day of the week, a new dispute arose as to the determination of Sunday itself. The text of the decree of the Council of Nicaea, which settled or at least indicated a final settlement of the difficulty, has not been preserved to us, but we have an important document inserted in Eusebius's Life of Constantine. The emperor himself, writing to the churches after the Council of Nicaea, exhorts them to adopt his conclusions and says, among other things, at this meeting the question concerning the most holy day of Easter was discussed, and it was resolved by the united judgment of all present that this feast also be kept by all and in every province on one and the same day. And the first of all, it appeared an unworthy thing that the celebration of the Jews who had impiously defiled their hands with enormous sin, for we've received from our Savior a different way. And I myself have undertaken that this decision should meet with the approval of your sagaciousties, in the hope that your wisdoms will gladly admit the practice which is observed at once in the city of Rome and in Africa and throughout Italy and Egypt with the entire unity of judgment, and this from other indications which we cannot specifically see here. We learn the dispute now lay between the Christians of Syria and Mesopotamia and the rest of the world, and the important church of Antioch was still dependent upon the Jewish calendar for its Easter. So we have here, one of the things, the goals of the Council of Nicaea was affixing this day for the Easter celebration and informing it to all the Christians in the world that they need to conform to this practice. And you have Emperor Constantine basically lending his weight to how this practice should be meted. And in fact, they wanted to sever themselves from the calendars of the Jews. Now, it is important to mention that there was some difficulty with the calendar of the Jews at those times, mainly because by then the temple was destroyed and it was very difficult to do calendar sightings. It was a very frustrating process. So the Gentile Christian world that was relying on this calendar found some difficulty with, again, fixing the date, and it wasn't without problems. It wasn't until around a similar time period that the Jewish peoples came up with a fixed calendar to avoid these conflicts and controversies so they could go forward, and that calendar sustained them to this day. Now, many will lament at this point that if you have understanding, they might say, well, okay, I see what you're saying, that Easter, again, in its common practice today, is basically an invention of man, and perhaps the right way would be to celebrate it according to the Jewish calendar. However, the Jewish calendar is not necessarily on the right day because they use a fixed calendar today, and so on and so forth. That question is a little bit beyond the scope of dealing with this, but the simplest answer is to say is, if for someone by chance is a believer to stand with Israel and stand with God and sees the people of Israel and sees the Jewish people as God's providence in the world and that his hand is still upon them, to know that this is the calendar that they use by and large today, and they are not convinced that it is the most appropriate thing, but they keep to it by nature of convenience as well as inability to yet establish a proper calendar according to biblical methods, that this calendar is never meant for them to be used for all time, that they intend to eventually reestablish the proper system. You have to factor these things with an understanding of this. Okay, rather than say, well, I can't even trust the Jewish calendar, I can't even figure out what this day was, I'm better off just celebrating Easter according to the other method, when the other method is not based on anything biblical. I find that quite an objectable position. Well, see, the only place that Easter is mentioned in the Bible is in the King James Version of the Bible, in Acts 12:4. It says, when he had apprehended them, he put them in prison and delivered them to 4 quaternions of soldiers to keep them, intending after Easter to bring them forth to the people. In other translations, like the Complete Jewish Bible, but not just them, NIV and so on and so forth, we see that. So when Herod seized him, he threw him in the prison, handing him over to the guard by 4 squads of 4 soldiers each, with the intention of bringing him to public trial after Pesach. All throughout the scriptures, you're going to find Pesach, okay? And when was this date? This was not the Sunday affixed by Romans. This is the book of Acts. This is very close to the time period of the crucifixion. This, of course, is the 14th of Nisan. In fact, this is in Asian territories, which we know, accordingly historically, if the New Advent Encyclopedia reference is to be trusted, that the Asiatics were the ones that were doing it on the 14th. Where are they? This is, we know another thing to ask here with this is, let's consider God's perspective now. God is not a God of confusion, Scripture says, right? He's a God of order, not a God of confusion. if we are to take, for example, the notion that God, the maker of heaven and earth, all the way back here in Genesis, it says, and God said, that let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven to divide the day from night, and let there be for signs and for seasons and for days and years. Oops, I don't want to go there. I want Genesis 1:14. Most Christian Bibles read for seasons here, right? God set the stars, divided the heaven day and night, and He put lights in the sky for times, for signs, for times and seasons. And we look here, we have an interlinear review showing the Hebrew, and we find here that the word is often translated as seasons. It's not summer, winter, spring, fall. It's actually moed, and it's appointments, right? Show it here. Moed. Feast, seasons, assemblies, right? Moed. Properly an appointment, a fixed time or season, specifically a festival, conventionally a year, an assembly, right? And in fact, when God gives His holidays in the Bible, they're called Moedim, and Passover is one of those. Passover is called a Moed. And why that's significant? Because that means all the way back here in Genesis, even preceding Genesis, because the thought precedes the deed, before Genesis even, but in Genesis, God set Passover as a day, an appointment. And then all these years later, He knew that He would have His Son, He would send His Son, Jesus, or Yeshua, to die on that specific day that He set all the way back at the beginning of time. To say, does it matter? Clearly it mattered to God. God didn't make an arbitrary day. He appointed that day from the beginning of time, that the 14th of Nisan. And we talk about this, in Christianity talk about this when the Exodus story is read and the blood of the Passover lambs and how this points to Christ and all these things. They say all this Passover stuff points to Christ, which is on this time period. Do you think it matters to God? Well, clearly it mattered enough to Him to say, I'm not going to choose an arbitrary day from this. I'm going to put it in the beginning of time, and I'm going to build all sorts of meaning from it all the way through the years, so that when the event occurs, it will have the proper impact. There's no question of when Yeshua died. It says, and from henceforth Pilate sought to release Him, but the Jews cried out, saying, if thou let this man go, thou art not Caesar's friend. Whosoever maketh him a king speaketh against Caesar. And when Pilate therefore heard the saying, he brought Jesus forth and sat Him down on the judgment seat in the place that is called the pavement, but in Hebrew Gabbatha. And it was a preparation of Passover about the 6th hour. And he saith unto the Jews, behold your king. But they cried out, away with him, crucify him. And Pilate saith unto them, shall I crucify your king? And the chief priest answers, we have no king but Caesar. So this all he was trying on the preparation of Passover. This is no question. This is not a debate. Doesn't matter. Deuteronomy says this, but you shall utterly destroy them, namely the Hittites and the Ammonites and the Canaanites and the Perizzites and the Hivites and the Jebusites, as Yahweh your God has commanded you, that they teach you not to do after their abominations which they have done unto their gods, so you should sin against Yahweh your God. In other words, according to God, you're not to learn from the pagans their forms of worship and practice them to Him. At the beginning of the encyclopedia reference, it stated that there was a 7-day feast, and it was associated with Easter, a pagan goddess. Someone might say, well, that's Deuteronomy, right? Well, again, here in Deuteronomy it says, "Take heed yourself that you be snared by following after them, after they be destroyed before you, that you not inquire after their gods, saying, How do these nations serve their gods? Even so I do likewise. Thou shalt not do so to Yahweh our God. For every abomination Yahweh which he hates they have done unto their gods, for their sons and their daughters have burnt in the fire to their gods, and what thing soever I command you, observe to do it. You shall not add thereto nor diminish from it." You shall not add or diminish. Now, this is a principle that's huge in Christianity, especially when it comes to sola scriptura. You shall not add or take away from. Well, then, if this is a truism in Christianity, you have to explain to me how Easter is not doing that. You're taking away from the date of Passover, and you're then adding something new. And more so, you are treating it as effectively a commandment of God. This is right for us to do in the sight of God. Now, I can already hear the sense of some that might grumble and murmur and say, but that is the law, and we're freed from that, right? As it said in the encyclopedia, we're under a new way. Well, I have to quickly ask you then, if that is true for that, is it not true for this, which is also found in Deuteronomy? Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, right? There's one Lord. You shall love God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your might. And what? And you shall teach them to your children. You shall... If that is done and not relatable, then so is this. You have no obligation to teach your children. You can't quote this verse or use this verse for those principles. This isn't twisting things. This isn't debating things. I close with one final thing with the words from our Master himself. That is Matthew 22:40. When we talk of this, it says here, if we go back, what did we just read in Deuteronomy 6:4? And here it says in verse 35, then one of them, which was a lawyer or scribe, asked him a question, tempting him and saying, Master, which is the greatest commandment in the law, or the Torah? And Jesus or Yeshua said, Thou shalt love thy Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, and with all thy mind. It is the first and great commandment. And the second is like unto it, Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. And on these two commandments hang the law and the prophets. If anyone construes the law, as we just read back there in Deuteronomy, and the prophets to be anything but love, you don't understand them. And this is exactly what Yeshua just said. He said the law and the prophets hang from loving God and loving your neighbor. They hang from that. They depend upon that. Anyone that sees the law and the prophets as anything but loving God and loving your neighbor do not understand them according to our Messiah. So the plea here then is to consider during this time and season as we preach the point where these 2 days come forth, that Christians should earnestly seek God and earnestly seek whether this is true and earnestly seek whether they should follow after the majority to do what is potentially not right in the face of God nor his Son, or do what is right and follow after the manner prescribed by the apostles, the manner authorized in the scriptures, and celebrate the day of Passover in accordance, which would be the Bible.